Hello, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to another episode of Unfiltered IT. We'll be talking about Secure Access Service Edge today. Specifically, we're going to be talking SASE. That is the acronym. And we're going to be speaking with Sarah. Sarah, let's get into some intros here. Everybody kind of already knows who I am. I act as the CTO and Chief Architect for our Technology Consulting Advisory Division, as well as our MSP division here at Higher Information Group. But Sarah, why don't you tell everybody a little bit more about yourself and what really qualifies you to be a really great expert on SASE and SD-WAN technology here today?
Yes. Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Arnstein, and I am a sales engineer with a specific focus in both SD-WAN, which kind of naturally evolved into the SASE space. I also run a blog called Get SASE with Sarah, so where I talk about different aspects within the SASE space and get kind of nitty-gritty in there whenever I find the time to write for that. And I would say half of my job is typically spent staying up to date on the SASE technologies and managed service providers in our portfolio, which sometimes can mean an hour-long training a couple of times a week. It can also mean me flying to the Palo Alto headquarters down in California, which I did a couple of weeks ago to meet with their team one-on-one and really talk through the technical aspects that have changed and what's coming forward so that I can then relay that information to our clients. And then the other half of my job is doing just that, getting on calls with clients to understand their environment and then in the end make recommendations of technologies and managed service providers that they can go with moving forward that's going to be best for their environment.
And Sarah is a unique user in the fact that she heavily relies on SASE because Sarah, you do a lot of not just work travel, but there's been plenty of times that we've been on calls together with customers, and I know you are traveling just because you can work remotely, and you like to travel, and you like to have a different view of your workspace out the office window, and you're perfectly okay with that being a hotel in some far off land. Is that correct?
Yes, I am known for picking up and going to Europe for a couple weeks at a time and working from there. My favorite so far has been Scotland. I've been there a couple times, and I really can't wait to go back there. But yes, that is something that people know me for.
So you're definitely leveraging the suite of SASE solution when you're doing those types of things, I would assume.
Yeah, you have to. And we'll get into the remote workforce later
Yeah.
on in this presentation. But yeah, you definitely need to if you're going to be doing that.
So, Sarah, I pulled some of these from an interesting article, and I'm just kind of going to go through them. I know some of the people that watch this love these kind of initial facts that I find and put together. But I call these the SASE facts about SASE. And, some of these are astronomical. So you talked about the remote work and a survey, 51% of people say making remote and hybrid work safe is their top priority. This goes along with, there's another item on here, 52% of organizations report that SASE has enhanced their remote work security post-deployment. And around 49% of them claim that has decreased breach incidents based upon that. And we're also seeing kind of that trickle down effect. I know, let's kind of step back 3-4 years ago, we were seeing SASE really deployed at the enterprise level. What are you seeing? Maybe you could talk about that more. I see that trickling further and further down market. We saw it come to the mid market, and now we're even kind of seeing further that come to the small, like the SMB world. And really, what are you seeing from that perspective as an industry as a whole?
Yeah, I don't really think there's a minimum size company that is a fit for SASE. I think, and again, we'll go over a few case studies later on, but or use cases later on, I should say. And we'll see that, anyone with remote users will be a fit. Anyone moving applications to the cloud will be a fit. It doesn't matter how many users you have, one user can lead to an incident. So we need to make sure that, even if we do have a small environment, that it's as secure as it possibly can be.
Yeah, and I think you had talked about cloud and cloud workloads or cloud applications. I think that's the one thing that a lot of IT professionals are struggling with today is they're used to kind of that classic castle and moat mentality. All of my users are in the office, all of my infrastructure is at this site or at this data center, and I can put my big old Cisco Firepower firewall out in front of this, and I've got everybody protected. But everything's so distributed now. We might have certain workloads in Azure for production. We may have workloads in AWS for DevOps. We might have SaaS-based applications in Salesforce and Microsoft, the Microsoft suite. And then we couple that with the added complexity of now everybody's working from everywhere all the time. It is really astronomical the way that IT professionals are being asked to secure and really wrap their arms around all of these areas where they need to secure. And again, classically, it was put the firewall out in front of everybody and we're safe. But we're definitely seeing a pivot. And I guess with that, let's take a step back and kind of just talk about, the concept of SASE. Sarah, do you want to kind of get into the history of SD-WAN and the concept of SASE and how SASE was kind of born and what its purpose truly is and how it wraps SD-WAN and security all together?
Yes. So this is a slide that I like to harp on a little bit too much sometimes, because SASE truly is a concept and it's not a point product anymore. Right? In the past, we were used to deploying firewalls. We were used to deploying SD-WAN devices. Those were point products. And now we're looking at the solution from a more holistic viewpoint. And at this point, we're looking at it as, how can we get you the most secure network? How can we get you the most efficient network? And for some clients, that might look like a different set of features within SASE, because SASE really is a framework instead of those point products. So it's essentially a set of features, which we'll go over the features in a moment here, but essentially a set of features. And we always need to have a conversation with our clients around what features are going to be the best for your environment. Because like I said, some companies might have remote users, and so they might need the zero trust network access or the ZTNA component. And some might not be using any cloud-based applications. So Secure Web Gateway or CASB might not be a fit for them. So it really depends on the unique environment and how we can help make those users and those applications secure and efficient, no matter where they're sitting in the world.
Yeah. And Sarah, you talked about, this being kind of an approach or an architecture rather than it being like a point product or a point solution. And you did kind of discuss how, we're moving away from that point product, one thing for this, one thing for that. Are you seeing as well from the IT professional side? What are you hearing from them? Because I hear a lot that the SASE products have made their job of managing these more complex infrastructures a lot simpler, because they're not making changes on one device and then having to go over and make changes on another device or in a different platform and having to marry policies between multiple platforms. I know we're kind of getting into the components of SASE there with that type of conversation, but talk a little bit about that, if you could, about what you're seeing with the simplification of management and ease of network management and monitoring with these solutions.
Yeah, that's actually an interesting talking point, because that, going back to your question earlier about the different sizes of companies and what they're doing, I think we're seeing a difference in those enterprise accounts versus more of the SMB space, because in the SMB space, they might have a 1 or 2 person IT department who is managing everything. And that's where, SASE as a holistic solution, including the network side and the security side, is going to be really beneficial for them, because like you said, you have maybe 1 person managing the network and they can make policy changes, see everything within the network and the security space within one dashboard and not have to flip between different portals to make changes that way. However, with the more enterprise clients I'm seeing, they have sometimes siloed departments to where they might have a security department that is not going to listen to, talk to, or even try to integrate with anything the network department is doing, or vice versa. Or it's not all of the security guys as the bad guys, but they typically tend to look at their silo individually. So the security team might look for Secure Web Gateway products or CASB or ZTNA to implement, and they might be going with just SSE, which is Secure Service Edge, which is basically just the security side of SASE. They might be looking at SSE, whereas the network team might be looking at SD-WAN. And if that's the case, we can work with that. We can make sure that we're getting them 2 solutions that are integrated with each other. Or if we're talking to the network team and we need we need an SD-WAN solution that can integrate with an already existing SSE platform that the security team went with. We can do that. So sometimes we do need to work with other teams in the organization, but in essence, we're looking to help simplify the management of everything. So if it is two separate teams, totally fine, but we just would need to make sure they integrate and work with each other. But that is kind of the difference that we're seeing in terms of who's managing what and in what types of organizations.
Okay. And I know I had spoke a little bit when I was introing this slide with you about Gartner and how Gartner has played kind of a somewhat critical role in the SASE space. And here's a slide of a market analysis that Gartner provided. And I think this one slide here is pretty telling. 67% of SD-WAN purchases will be part of a SASE solution. I've had several customers come to me and say, where is the Gartner report on SD-WAN? And so maybe you can fill in some of those blanks for people as to why we're here and why there is so much SD-WAN sold as a portion or a part of the SASE solution that's being provided.
Yeah, a couple of years ago, I actually heard someone say, and this stuck with me, but I heard someone say SD-WAN isn't a product anymore; it's a feature of SASE, and that is kind of what we're seeing. Because even if we are having conversations around SD-WAN, like I said before, security is always involved in that. We always need to make sure that they can work together. But most of the time, we are having conversations around SASE as a whole. I would say about 5-6 years ago, we were having conversations around which SD-WAN provider is going to be the best. Talari was still on the market. We had, Cisco, Viptela, Fortinet, all those original players. But now it's more so what type of SD-WAN is going to be best for the architecture, but also what type of security is going to be best. So we are having more and more conversations around just SASE as a whole and not SD-WAN anymore. So I would agree with that statistic. I think that's what we're seeing as well.
And I think I heard some uniqueness where like Gartner kind of had a hand in helping develop what how they were going to build out SASE as part of how it needed to look, because there was no Gartner Magic Quadrant for SD-WAN. I don't know that there still is, but I certainly know that there is one for SASE. I know that I believe some of the vendors all kind of came together and came to Gartner and said, here's what we'd like to see as how you're going to score the SASE environment with a Gartner Magic Quadrant, and what's really required to be a SASE solution over just an SD-WAN solution.
Yeah, it was Gartner that kind of came out. Well, it was Gartner that coined the term SASE to begin with, but it was also Gartner that kind of came out with the guardrails on what features different platforms needed to be considered SASE and to even be considered for part of this quadrant here.
Yeah. And so we talked about features. I guess let's get into that. So let's talk about what sort of components make up a SASE solution. And kind of we'll get into a little bit more of the security definitions as well, and then what at a bare minimum must be included to really be a full SASE solution. But do you want to talk a little bit about the WAN components versus the networking components of a SASE solution and kind of how they fall under each bucket here, like I have them laid out?
Yeah, absolutely. So I agree. I like to split it up into these different buckets just to make it clear on where we stand, because everything in that second bucket could be potentially part of an SSE solution, whereas, combined together, that's when we get full SASE. And I would say in the WAN edge services bucket, SD-WAN is the one that we get asked about most often, I guess, along with bandwidth aggregation and network management, if circuits are going to be, part of the opportunity there. But WAN optimization, there are a couple vendors that offer it still. It definitely was popular years ago, but now we don't see it as much. And then content delivery network, that's just something that, some of them offer that it's typically not part of SASE solutions, but I just like to kind of throw it out there as an option for clients that, might have, internet resources that need to be accessed by people globally. But SD-WAN is definitely the one that gets talked about most in that bucket. And then the security side, we do have a slide with the definitions coming up. So I won't go into that too much here, but these are just a few of the security services that can be included with SASE. A lot of the solutions do go kind of above and beyond. Some of them are even offering more cybersecurity features like MDR and stuff like that now. But this is kind of where the standard of SASE lies, I would say.
Okay. And yeah, to echo what you said about the WAN side of things, I think that WAN optimization as the use of a term has kind of fallen out of favor more for things like SD-WAN and bandwidth optimization over the classic WAN optimization statement. And so we talked about some of the security features. You know, anybody that's been watching for a few months knows that we navigated the alphabet soup with a colleague of Sarah, Rick from Avant, and his security expertise. And some of these came up, CASB, ZTNA. We talked about those at length. But Sarah, do you want to touch on how these kind of interweave with the components of SASE and what some of these are here for, that for people that might not be familiar with some of these acronyms or have missed in the previous?
Sure. So these are essentially the security features that need to be included in SASE to be considered SASE. So that's kind of where I wanted to start with these definitions here. So the first one, Cloud Access Security Broker, or CASB, as most people will refer to it as, it's essentially its own framework, if you will, which it gets really confusing because it's a framework within a framework, but it's composed of different features like authentication, data loss prevention would be included here, tokenization, and other features that all work together to protect access to cloud-based applications. So that's where, you know, if someone is using cloud-based applications, CASB is something that will be beneficial to their environment.
Yeah.
Then we have, oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think the important thing to denote there is CASB isn't exclusive to a place where you could historically have put either a physical or a virtual firewall in front of, correct? So we can put a CASB solution out in front of what others would historically have called, you know, shared SaaS-based services. Think things like HubSpot and Salesforce and, Oracle NetSuite, hosted Oracle NetSuite, or, Office 365 or Google Apps for Business. They can all be protected by CASB, which historically has been somewhat of a blind spot for IT administrators because their statement is, well, I can't put a firewall in front of this. How do I secure it?
Mm-hmm. Yep, and then secure web gateway and firewall oftentimes kind of get lumped together because, you know, they're both protecting internet traffic essentially. But that's what they're doing. Secure web gateway is more so typically hosted in the cloud at a gateway. And then some people will refer to it as SWIG. If you hear that, that's typically secure web gateway. And then firewall, obviously we all know what firewall is. Firewall as a service is typically where we're looking at the hosted cloud-based firewall that is associated with SASE.
And then I think the one that I see drive this more than any of the others is Zero Trust, ZTNA, and kind of the classic replacement of, or the replacement of the classic VPN solution. I mean, it's just, it's VPN was not built for a modern world.
Yeah, and it wasn't built for a very secure one either, to be honest, because with a traditional VPN, you're looking at, you know, you log in and you get access to all the resources within the company. Whereas ZTNA, it is really zero trust. So if I'm on the engineering team, I don't need access to what marketing is doing, what finance is doing. So don't give me access to them because God forbid someone gets my credentials and logs in as me. We don't want them to have access to anything that they don't need or anything that I wouldn't need. And then on the flip side, if you take my scenario, for example, you mentioned that I like to work remotely from Europe. It will catch things like that. So ZTNA can work with CASB to catch things like, oh, Sarah is usually logging in 9 to 5 in Northwest Washington. Now she's logging in at 2 a.m. from Brazil or from Paris or wherever. You know, that's going to be something that it's going to flag and let the administrator know so that they can check into that. So yeah, ZTNA, truly a next-gen VPN, and that is one that sometimes we see clients even starting with ZTNA. Like they'll deploy that just for their remote users and then slowly trickle in the other features of SASE. But that one is very important for literally any company that has remote users.
Yeah, I think for me personally, the customers that I've been interacting with, I think ZTNA and that classic VPN replacement has actually been what's driving the rest of that SASE conversation. And specifically, Sarah, I don't know if you're hearing the same, but I see a lot of cyber liability insurance also driving that, because they're starting to push for customers to move away from that classic, less secure VPN solution in light of something. And then as well, you had touched on kind of properly egressing employees to the resources that they need to get to, and people look at that from their own employee aspect. But I've had a lot of success with manufacturing industries and industries that have a lot of OT or IoT based devices, especially being managed by third parties. Think in the manufacturing world, all of these smart devices that they have out in a plant, a lot of the vendors that provide those want to be able to have some sort of always on access to manage those devices. And so a lot of success with then helping customers secure all of those vendors by properly egressing those to their devices that they respectfully need access to. Kind of trying to mitigate years ago what happened with the Target credit card breach. That ultimately was that ultimately came through from a managed HVAC provider that was managing the HVAC solution in Target's data center and had a VPN that allowed access that was compromised. So and I know we talked about, some of the components that must include, there were some on that list, but, I think we had already touched on this one, but centralized management is really one of the other key things. I think on the firewall side, Cisco, Meraki, Ubiquiti has really pushed that centralized management. The Fortinet also has a really good centralized cloud management solution. And I think that's what we're seeing more and more of is, IT professionals don't want to have to log into all 6 of their firewalls and make the same adjustment. They want to make a rule in one interface, hit a button, push it down to the rest of the devices in the organization.
Yeah, and even taking it a step further with not logging into every single separate firewall to make changes, it's, we don't even want you to have to log into a security portal versus an SD-WAN portal. It should truly all just be in one centralized management portal.
Yeah. And I think another thing with centralized management that people kind of miss is we've talked about centralized management of firewalls or the security tools, but I think oftentimes people overlook the fact that if I am maybe in a classic VPN situation, or I have employees that leave with devices and potentially work remotely, the question becomes, how do I secure them and apply the same policies that they have when they're in the office, if they're hybrid, and when they're out of the office? And again, that centralized management and SWIG really help with those elements. Mm. And so I know there's a couple of different, what I would refer to like reference architectures or models. So, let's get into which kind of SASE fits customers, or which kind of SASE is available, those kind of classic models. I know there's 3 kind of major ones, and maybe if you could talk about some of the use cases where some make sense more than others and things like that.
Sure. So with the edge model, this is kind of where things started. And in my mind, this isn't true SASE because there's no cloud component, but just to kind of start somewhere here. This one, you've got, whether these 2 buildings are data centers, headquarters, branch offices, whatever they are, just 2 buildings, you've got a device at each site, whether that's an SD-WAN device or firewall, likely both in this scenario. And you can use that to connect to each other site to site. If you have applications that are hosted in a data center, this is often used for that. You can also use private MPLS with these types of setups, and you can connect to cloud-based applications or the public internet. And the drawback here when connecting to more cloud or SaaS-based applications is that, sure, for public cloud, you can always put one of these devices as a virtual machine into AWS, Azure, GCP, and kind of have that as another site on your WAN in that way. But when you're connecting to UCaaS or other SaaS-based applications like Office 365, Salesforce, anything like that, you don't have as much control or granular visibility over that traffic once it leaves your site. So you don't get that dynamic path selection within SD-WAN. You don't get forward error correction, packet duplication, etc. Because there's no bookended device, there's no cloud presence for your device at your site to connect to, which is the benefit of the next 2 models we'll talk about being that cloud presence.
And this slide is like the perfect ideal IT world because I think there's a little bit of something missing from this slide, which is this slide doesn't really talk about any on-premise infrastructure and how you handle fault tolerance for that, or worst case scenario, you're publicly exposing something that has to be on-premise, a web server, an application, things like that. It's how do we handle the fault tolerance for that? Hey, I have two internet service providers, but DNS is IP based. And so how do I fail it over and fail it back? I have two different public IP addresses that we have to kind of switch between, or even sometimes dynamic path routing. Building A might have their internet down or might have one of their internet legs down, but building B should be able to route the traffic around to get back to building A if they have some sort of available internet. And I think those are the elements that historically with these edge-based models, has had to be all done via architecture and programming. It's not kind of just baked in there and almost figured out for you in essence in the way that a SASE solution provides. So, we'll jump from that edge-based model to the gateway-based model, which is kind of the first iteration of true SASE where it places things in the cloud.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So this is where I would say we're getting into, the SASE providers. This is some of the top SASE providers do offer gateway-based models. And this is where, we still have the devices at each site, but now we have these globally distributed gateways, which act as kind of a large multi-tenanted version of SD-WAN and network security. So the SD-WAN is hosted at these gateways, meaning you will have full SD-WAN benefits from your site to the cloud, and then it's a short hop on the public internet to wherever you need to go. They also house the security components. So CASB Secure Web Gateway, ZTNA, will be hosted in these gateways, meaning if you do have remote employees or traveling employees, they can connect directly to these gateways, and they don't have to home back to the data center where these devices are hosted at. And that's huge because that's also a very big limitation of traditional VPN. Again, if we use me as an example here, I might have typically homed back to a VPN concentrator, maybe near Seattle, more likely with my company, probably Arizona or Chicago. Whereas if I go across the pond to Europe, I'm still hairpinning all of my traffic back to wherever that VPN concentrator is. And I don't think I would be able to work like that. Like, I don't think I would have so much latency where it just wouldn't be a good experience and I wouldn't be able to do that. But your traffic will dynamically route to the gateway that you're closest to with ZTNA. So that means that I'm as secure as I can be, and my traffic is following me so that I don't have to hairpin all of it back to the US.
And Sarah, to kind of piggyback on what you said, the thing that I end up seeing from security and IT professionals is they take that trade-off. They either say, we're going to hairpin traffic, and then that's what happens, and you have the performance issues of that, or they split tunnel, and then you lose visibility on the security side of things. Now there's a layer where I can't see, and my traffic is not being shaped when it goes to the greater public internet or potentially a SASE service as well, or a SaaS service as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so the final model here is the POP-based model, and I think generally, I know there's still gateway model is out there, but I think you would agree this is the more modern SASE solutions I see as more of the POP-based model. And really, this is where the industry, I believe, is probably moving as a whole, or has moved as a whole.
Agreed. Yeah. So this is essentially the same architecture type as gateway, but now we're calling them POPs because all of the POPs are connected by a private network backbone. So this is very useful for global companies that need to send traffic between continents because you can ride that network backbone instead of relying on the public internet for that. It's also really useful for the use case of getting traffic in and out of mainland China. If you've got a location in China and you need to get around that Chinese firewall, this private network backbone can do that, as opposed to an MPLS circuit or another type of private line, as opposed to using that. But yeah, still the same thing with gateway. You've got remote employees, you've got traveling employees. Their connection will dynamically change to the POP that's closest to them at any given point in time, which again is huge for their efficiency and security. And then, the SD-WAN and security features are, again, hosted at these POPs. So you have full SD-WAN benefits from site to POP, as well as security benefits to any type of application you're accessing.
And I think this is interesting because I hear people talk about SD-WAN and SASE, and the conversation is definitely not equal. So, you look at historically, some of the kind of more firewall-centric providers, if you would. So think of like a Fortinet or a Palo Alto. They're almost playing catch up to some of these other more POP-based vendors like a Cato or an Ariaka. And we see that just because, their kind of classic model was that edge or potentially gateway, depending on how you configured it. And now they're looking to move. I know Fortinet now has a more POP-based solution, and Palo Prisma is POP-based as well. It's cloud-oriented. Do you see, and I believe Cisco is also moving to that model as well. I think they have a product on the Meraki side and the Cisco side of things that does a more POP-based model as well. Do you see that continuing to move that direction? Do you see kind of the classic firewall in a box vendors that you're getting, or firewall in a stick vendors that you're getting? Do you see them all kind of making that more progressive hop to the POP-based model?
Yeah. So back in 2019, when SASE was first coined, it was kind of coined around Cato, one might argue. Cato was doing something that other SD-WAN providers weren't doing, and so comparing them in the Gartner Magic Quadrant just wasn't possible. It was apples to oranges at that point. And when Gartner came out with the term SASE, a lot of firewall vendors and on the other side, SD-WAN vendors started to either make acquisitions or build in-house to supplement the part that they didn't have. So SD-WAN vendors like Ariaka started to build security features into their infrastructure to be able to offer full SASE, whereas firewall providers like Fortinet, which Fortinet already had some sort of SD-WAN in their devices, but Palo Alto is a good example. They acquired CloudGenix for the SD-WAN piece, which is still the SD-WAN part of their SASE product today. And what I saw initially was Ariaka, for instance. I'll take them. They already had this global WAN infrastructure built out. They were already a POP-based SD-WAN before SASE became a thing. So they built the security side from the ground up and deployed it at all their POPs. Whereas some of the firewall vendors, that was kind of their biggest struggle, was building out this infrastructure on a global scale. So some of them are using public cloud to build that out instead of putting their infrastructure into data centers around the world, because that was an easier setup to get started with, but it's also kind of easier for them to maintain moving forward. And I don't necessarily think one's better than the other, but it's just interesting to see how that kind of played out. But yeah, this is definitely where most vendors are kind of trending now.
Gotcha. And so to piggyback off of that, before we jump into these scenarios, a couple more questions for you. When you look at these three different models and somebody comes to you as an industry professional and says, what considerations should I make when I look at what's available to me? Like, what do you think are IT professionals should be looking at as consideration for kind of these reference architectures, or which reference architecture to kind of pick? I know we're definitely singing the praises of the POP-based model, but one size doesn't necessarily fit all, and everybody is unique and different. Do you see strengths and weaknesses in these, and that help kind of determine which model might look better for the different customers and professionals that are out there building them?
Yes, and I'll say this in as few words as possible to kind of make it succinct here. I would say if a company has all or most of their critical applications in a data center or on site, and all of their users are sitting in an office, not remote, the edge-based option might be sufficient for them. There's not a real need for them to have a cloud presence in that case. When you move toward more cloud and SaaS-based applications and remote users, that's when we need to look at gateway or the POP-based model. And then if a client has globally dispersed people or locations, that's when we need to be looking at the POP-based model, especially if there's traffic going continent to continent. But if everyone is kind of regionalized, and their applications are near the users, then the gateway model would be sufficient for that.
Okay. And I think another question to ask, because this is one that I get, and again, it's just a pivot. This is newer technology, and there's been a long-standing history of I go buy a firewall every 5 to 7 years. My internal team handles the IPS and IDS patching of that firewall. Maybe talk through what somebody should expect on kind of the pricing model or the layout and the more subscription-based nature of a SASE solution over a classic firewall solution, because I know that's somewhat new to people and as well, and how some of them bill. I don't want to use the word bill for bandwidth, but they look at bandwidth on how to determine billing and things like that.
Mm-hmm. So you said it. It's more of a subscription base than buying a bunch of firewalls outright. So instead of buying all of the hardware, you'll typically be leasing the hardware that's on site, and then it's a monthly fee for the licensing to use the SD-WAN and the security. Now, when we're looking at the POP-based model, the usage of that network backbone is also going to be an extra line item. And you don't necessarily have to use the network backbone in this scenario. Like, I could use these POPs as gateways, like we talked about in that previous slide. So you don't have to send every traffic over that network backbone, but the traffic that makes sense, that's experiencing latency and maybe be global, that would make sense to send it over that network backbone. But yeah, it is definitely more of a subscription model. I will say some of the vendors are flexible in that if a company has a bunch of capital coming in and they want to buy the devices outright as an operational expense, or sorry, as a capital expense, that's totally fine, and they can be flexible that way. But typically, there is some monthly reoccurring cost in this type of solution.
And one other thing to kind of just jump backwards one step on the considerations as far as the like reference architectures are laid out. What do you say to customers who might have compliance or governing bodies where they don't necessarily, in a POP-based model, they don't want all that traffic going up to the cloud to be inspected because they want to just maybe push that traffic from one site to another? I'm thinking specifically, I've dealt with this in the banking and financial sector. They're a little more sensitive to that information going up and coming back down to another site through a POP to be reviewed. Is that where you still see that gateway or edge model being effective, or are there other considerations where if they have an environment that fits that POP-based model well, is there other considerations that can be made from kind of a configuration or professional services perspective to keep some of that data off of the greater infrastructure?
Yeah, I guess it would depend on whether they want no data going to the cloud-based gateway or POP, or if some data is okay and others is not. Because you can split tunnel, like you mentioned before. You can send certain traffic just site to site and other traffic to the cloud. Like if you want all of your internet-based traffic going to the cloud just because that's not as critical and you want that protected by that secure web gateway hosted up there, then that's fine. And then all of your critical data can be sent site to site, and that doesn't ever have to touch the gateway or the POP. And that can be set up by, like you said, some sort of professional services or managed services model.
Yeah. And I think another thing that's very interesting about some of these SASE providers or some of the options that are out there from a security perspective is historically, IT professionals have had limited ability to secure, that layer 2 traffic, inter-VLAN communication. But, I think we've talked before about this, specifically with a customer that I can remember, that they had some inter-VLAN communication that ideally would have benefited from having some sort of firewall between them. And with some of the solutions that are out there, you're able to send that traffic up to be inspected as if it was going through a firewall, and then send it back down to the site and send it back down to the appropriate VLAN or network that it needs to go to.
Yep, that's an option as well. There's the consideration of, some SASE vendors only have the security functionality at the POP, and they rely on the device to kind of get them up to the POP to go through those security features, and then go back down either to that same site or to a different site or to the cloud or wherever it's going. but some also have all of the security functionality in the device. So it just kind of depends on the type of solution that they end up going with. But yeah, I mean, that's goes back to why I say we always need to have a conversation about what's going on in the environment, because those are the little nuances that you might not think to talk about, when you're first looking at these technologies.
Yeah, and then I think, one of the other big compelling factors that I've heard of from some people in the industry as to why they're utilizing and love these SASE products is really the monitoring aspects of
Mhm.
it. We're used to a world where I've got to, stand up this audacious SolarWinds instance because I've got to be able to monitor my WAN connections. I've got to monitor all my switches. I've got to monitor all of my firewalls. I might have to monitor the network security appliances or applications that are included in the network side of those things. And what I've really seen is almost a consolidation of that. You talked about centralized management, but it's really like centralized interface. I can see that all with most of these providers in a singular pane of glass. And then from a like incident response and a security team exploration, really having that ability to kind of see and navigate where something may have occurred, how it traversed the network, where it went when the incident occurred.
Yeah, I would say that's something that I forget sometimes as a benefit to SASE, because we used to talk about it as a benefit of SD-WAN way back in the day. But yeah, the visibility that you get into the network is unmatched. Like, you no longer have to go to a carrier and guess that it was their fault. You have the data in front of you. And you also have the ability to turn on and off features with the click of a toggle. It's that simple. You don't necessarily need an IT background to be able to manage one of these things. And most of the platforms that I've seen out there from these vendors are super slick like that.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess let's talk about some of these scenarios, because I think the most helpful thing when customers listen to us talk about these things is really hearing an example and going, that sounds like me. So you've provided a couple of examples that we've worked on in the past. So let's talk about one of these scenarios. Let's start with this first one here. The scenario here is customer was moving to a cloud-based phone system or a UCaaS solution. They're also heavily relying on SASE. So they're an Office 365, a Salesforce, and they're looking to move workloads from on-premise to Azure, AWS, GCP, or some sort of private hosted cloud. So in that situation, let's talk through that scenario, what that looks like.
Sure. So this is one where, you could get by with having a cloud-based firewall and maybe the SD-WAN functionality on that cloud-based firewall, maybe like a FortiGate device at your site. And that would be okay. But if you wanted it to be, the most efficient network that it could be, that's when we're looking at that cloud-based network security and SD-WAN solution added in. Because now if we're moving more and more to cloud-based applications, that SD-WAN on site, it's going to give you QoS at the edge or traffic shaping, meaning I can prioritize my, real-time voice and video, maybe my Ring Central traffic over any ancillary internet traffic, like my employees using YouTube, Reddit, etc. So I can prioritize certain applications over others, but you don't get, again, that dynamic path selection, the forward error correction, the typical SD-WAN benefits that you get site to site. You don't get site to cloud with that premise-based firewall and SD-WAN device. So that's when we would suggest moving to a cloud-based SD-WAN and firewall, or cloud-based SD-WAN and further network security, because SASE does include obviously more than just the firewall. It includes other things like ZTNA, CASB, Secure Web Gateway, the other security features that we talked about earlier on.
Yeah. And I think, uniqueness with especially UCaaS in the environment, what I'm hearing from a lot of professionals is kind of how to manage UCaaS in the modern world. I think you're one of the best people to talk about this, because I know you also are very well versed at the UCaaS, CCaaS side of things. And what I've heard from a lot of IT professionals is, we're used to the days where everybody had a phone on their desk. And so we could put the proper, dump all the phones to a VLAN, put the proper QoS and bandwidth management on that VLAN. But now I actually have seen a big trajectory change where it's almost, we used to ask who doesn't want a phone, and now we're asking who does want a phone. And if you want a physical phone, a lot of times it's, hey, we've got to have management approve these individuals getting a physical phone. And so the added level of complexity that requires for the IT professionals, because the phone's not isolated to its own VLAN. The data looks the same as all the other traffic coming from that computer. It's just Ring Central or Vonage or 8x8 or Zoom soft phone client.
Yeah, and that's one thing I would, and I didn't go into this at the beginning here, but I did used to be a UCaaS, CCaaS engineer before I came over to the WAN side. And one thing that we always had to ask about was, how do you plan on connecting to UCaaS? Hopefully it was the public internet. It got a little bit dicier when people said, MPLS or private networks. But now it's, okay, how are you connecting? Hopefully public internet. But also, do you have an SD-WAN solution in place? Because a lot of times we do get clients who deploy UCaaS and then, all of a sudden they're experiencing latency or they're experiencing jitter, and their most critical application, the real-time voice and video, the thing that might actually make them money for their users to, talk with end clients, whatever they need to do on the phone. If that's not working, that's an issue. So that's where, SD-WAN should be involved there heavily.
Yeah. So let's talk about, this is one of my favorite scenarios, because this is like this is an alley-oop as far as that is concerned. Aging private network or MPLS, everybody knows those are incredibly expensive solutions to put in place, and then not only to have, but just to maintain as well. And then certainly I get a lot of customers that are evaluating, do they need to maintain their private network, along with how do we maintain our existing either firewall or layer 3 infrastructure. And I think this is a great time to be involved and have that conversation about SASE.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this was we also had a similar slide on this again when we were just talking about SD-WAN, because that SD-WAN portion of SASE, that device at least can replace the router, the firewall. Sometimes it can even replace the Wi-Fi access point for certain devices. But when you're looking at already replacing firewalls or already replacing routers or whatever network you have in place today, that's just kind of a natural progression to say, could SASE be a good fit? Could we be more efficient? Could we be more secure in our environment? And we're always open to having those types of conversations, even if it's a no, even if it's you might as well just stick with firewalls because all of your data is hosted at a data center and all of your users are on site, like I mentioned before. Even if that's what it ends up being, it's always worth a conversation just to make sure that you've got the best setup that you can.
Yeah. And I think something unique here as well is either I've seen kind of managed service providers also come with a SASE offering, or managed service providers almost turn firewall as a service into a pseudo. We've talked about, can you host one of these as a POP yourself? The short answer is you could host it yourself, but also I see a lot of like SASE providers. I believe, I think it's Lumen has a very specific solution where they host some of those devices in their data centers. And so it gives Lumen customers the added capability to utilize those in a POP capacity, even though it was more of an edge-based model, which we've talked about.
Yeah, an example of that is Fortinet, right? So Fortinet, for the longest time, it was mainly their FortiGate solution, which was a firewall. It had SD-WAN capabilities. They did come out with FortiSASE, which puts them into that SASE space. But way before that, Masergy, which is now part of Comcast, had deployed Fortinets into all of their gateways and connected it with a private backbone. So they had almost made their own POP-based SASE solution with an edge-based device, but made it in a way to where customers could have that POP-based solution without, giving up the cloud app optimization and the cloud-based security. That was really slick.
Yeah. So another scenario here, SD-WAN and security solutions must account for mobile and remote users. We need some ZTNA, some CASB, some SWIG in here, efficient access to company resources and web-based applications. And, this is not dissimilar from most of the conversations I think customers are having today, is VPN solutions just not keeping up with the demand. Maybe if you want to talk about what sort of model this looks like and what you would see in this sort of situation as well.
Yep. So this would typically be the gateway or the POP-based model when we're looking at, ZTNA remote users, because if you have remote users, I'm assuming all those remote users aren't in the same city, right? They're probably dispersed either nationally or internationally. And so you want them to have the ability to access applications with that gateway or that POP that's closest to wherever they're sitting, as opposed to deploying VPN concentrators all over the place to be able to account for them. And then in this case, we've also got CASB Secure Web Gateway, making sure their traffic to cloud-based applications and the internet is secure once they actually get to the POP. So I almost think of ZTNA as their connection to the POP, and then once they get there, they've got CASB and Secure Web Gateway to protect their traffic. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. And to kind of piggyback off of this scenario, I guess one of the scenarios that we don't often mention, but definitely does come up a lot with, a plethora of customers that I deal with, is not necessarily that their employees are remote, but I see often situations where a customer gets into, hey, we've outsourced our DevOps and our DevOps is overseas. How do we handle DevOps securely accessing and working on this infrastructure? Or, maybe it's not development operations. Maybe it's who's responsible for managing their CRM or their new ERP that they're implementing. And so how do we give them secure access and also make sure that we're not opening ourselves up to security threats because we have a handful of individuals that are potentially located somewhere overseas, where we have less visibility into what networks they're connecting from, the devices that they're connecting on, things like that. I guess that's an element that we didn't talk about is, some of those areas where you can almost audit the device every time it connects to your infrastructure as part of an SD-WAN solution. And certainly that exists with other security offerings out there, but I think it's something that's unique in this as an added layer of security in the SASE space.
Yeah, and not even just for, the example that you used is it almost sounds like permanent employees. They're just sitting outside the office internationally. But if you've got third-party contractors, they are going to be, working with the company for a couple of months. One of the cool things about ZTNA that we haven't talked about yet is that it can be client or clientless. So you can have to download something onto your machine to be able to access any of the applications or internet, whatever. But it can also be clientless. So it can be browser-based, and the person doesn't even have to download anything onto their computer. You do get a little bit less granularity that way from a security perspective, but that we see that use case a lot for third-party contractors that are a little bit more temporary. And then one other thing that I will mention here is that, especially with companies who have branch sites that are quite small, that might be, even 5 to 10 employees, and they don't necessarily want to deploy a full SD-WAN device to those sites because it might not make sense monetarily to them, because maybe they have a ton of these sites across the globe. They can actually treat all of those employees as if they're remote, and they can connect to the POP or the gateway through ZTNA and not necessarily through a device. So things can get pretty flexible in that way. Just depending on, like I said, it always comes back to we need a conversation to figure out what's going to work best for your environment.
Yeah, I've really seen that in like businesses that are focused on like these small, almost hotel remote offices where these individuals work remote a lot, but they might also have to meet clients at a site. And so not everybody is in this site 8 to 5, Monday through Friday. They're almost transient. Nobody's got pictures on their desks because it's kind of a first come first serve when you're meeting with customers. And I've seen a significant cost savings in a customer that didn't have to then replace all of the firewalls at each one of those sites by going this route, because you're right that we don't care where they are. I mean, for instance, we're saying they're in a building that we are owning or renting as the business, but that doesn't have to mean that we have to treat them like that from a firewall perspective. We can treat them like that's any other remote site. It looks no different to a SASE solution. It's no different than the plane's Wi-Fi or a Starbucks.
Mm-hmm. Yep, this is the big one for me. It's if you've got remote users, need to be looking at ZTNA at the very least, if not full SASE.
Especially, I think, larger organizations that have a lot of salespeople on the road too. I think this is a very good solution for them, even though they may not be necessarily geographically dispersed throughout all of the US. It might be, locational based to a state, but still just that, as an IT professional, I get very concerned. Like, what networks are you connecting onto? What can they see from a data perspective? If you're in and out of customer sites, you don't know what's going on at those customers or prospective customers. So ZTNA really handles a lot of that. And then especially, let's just not throw coffee shops and public Wi-Fi into that mix and make things even more of a security nightmare.
Agreed.
And so scenario 4 really highlights that greater visibility that we've talked about. Increased security for everybody. I know we've kind of hit home with this about how policies can be applied universally across the both the physical devices and the individuals that are connecting, either via that browser based or through kind of a classic VPN replacement solution. And then one of the things that we haven't spoke about but that I have seen is the increase in more like highly compliant industries getting a lot out of the SASE solution because they can adhere to those compliancy standards. Do you maybe want to speak to that a little bit more as well?
Yeah, I don't get too involved in the compliance conversations because I'm not an expert on compliances in general, but when our clients start talking to these SASE vendors, that's when it starts coming out to where they need this data to remain in compliance with, whatever compliance it is for your particular industry. There are some platforms out there that are even FedRAMP compliant. So for those types of clients, we've got platforms that can help you out with that. But yeah, that data is the big one that can help with this.
Yeah, and so we're kind of getting ready to wrap here. It's been almost an hour, and I really appreciate the time, Sarah. Love talking shop with you, and I'm sure our customers will appreciate some of the things that we've discussed today as well. Always provide this slide. I think we've mentioned a lot of individuals on this slide, but just briefly, if you could hit some of the vendors on this side and kind of maybe elaborate on, I know we've talked Fortinet, I know we've talked about Cato, but just maybe touch on them just a little bit. Nothing, super in depth, but what your thoughts are on some of these vendors and where they would best suit a customer, the type of customers they best suit.
Sure. So I would say Cato, Palo Alto, and Ariaka are kind of the top platforms in that POP-based model, with one exception, which I'll talk about in just a second. But they're going to be, the POP-based global providers that are going to be able to optimize global traffic, continent to continent. They're going to be able to optimize cloud-based applications, and they're going to be able to secure the connection of anyone, anywhere to any application. So those are 3 providers that I go to very often for clients that are looking for kind of that robust SASE solution that we've been talking about. Open Systems is one I want to touch on here because they are a very interesting provider. You won't see them in Gartner. I think that they just don't subscribe to, wanting to be part of Gartner at this point. But they have a platform that can be either edge-based or POP-based.
Interesting.
And so they can get very flexible in that way. They have POPs deployed globally, but all of their security functionality is in that edge device as well. So if you only need an edge-based solution at certain sites, they can do that. And then if you need a POP-based solution for other users or other sites, maybe for the remote users in the company, then they can do that. They're also very open to deploying new POPs for customers, and they have one of the best managed services departments that I've seen. Like their engineers that actually built the platform are the ones that man the service center that you'd call into if you have an issue. So I love them as a company, and I recommend them quite often for companies who, again, need a robust SASE solution, but maybe some of their sites are more of that edge-based architecture. And then the others like Cloudflare, Zscaler, those 2 are more security focused, I would say. They have very basic, and I use that word, I'm not using it derogatorily here. I'm just saying it's not as robust of an SD-WAN platform as the other players here. But they are very good in the security space. A lot of times we'll see customers pairing Zscaler with other SD-WAN platforms like a VeloCloud or a Silver Peak even. I see that combination a lot, Zscaler and Silver Peak. But yeah, those two are great on the security side. Versa, Fortinet, who else did I miss here? Cisco. Cisco, I honestly don't see as much. I think they have had kind of a hard time getting into the centralized management portion of SASE. And like you said, they're kind of getting there, but historically it was, I think, Meraki paired with Umbrella. And that was, it's just separate line items, separate management portals, and that kind of, confused a lot of companies. So we don't see them a ton unless we get a company who is heavy in the Cisco space. Then of course we'll take a look at that for them. And then the one I didn't touch on yet, VMware, which would be VeloCloud, that's more on the SD-WAN side and would basically need to be paired with like a Zscaler or a Palo Alto, something for security.
And I know that VMware, though, I believe I've heard they're trying to break into that more SASE space, but I know there's been a lot of uncertainty with VeloCloud, with everything that's happened with the acquisition of VMware and things like that. So I have a lot of people that are a little more gun shy to the VMware Velo over all the other solutions as well, just because of the uncertainty that we've been talking about for the past almost 2 years now. It's hard to believe, almost the past 2 years in the industry with VMware. They're still causing a level of uncertainty in different areas.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard the same thing for the last couple of years that, Velo's I heard that it was gonna be paired with Symantec and it was gonna be kind of a Palo Alto CloudGenix situation with VeloCloud and Symantec, but that obviously didn't happen, and I'm not holding my breath for VeloCloud to come out with security anytime soon, to be honest.
Definitely. Well, Sarah, we are just a hair over the top of the hour, and so it's been about an hour here. I really appreciate the time today, and I'm sure our customers appreciate the time. As always, for everybody that watches this, certainly you can use this QR code to connect with me. If you want to have a deeper conversation with myself and Sarah, more than happy to get all of us coordinated together. Also, please feel free to reach out to your hire information group sales employee to get that squared away as well. And thank you so much for your time today, Sarah.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks. Have a good one.
All right, see ya.